Good morning. We're continuing the review, conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on page 1428. And I say review and conclusion just to remind everyone, we have learned all this already once, a few years ago, until the conclusion. But being that the Rebbe Rashab never concludes Hemshech Ayin Beis, all the themes and all the questions that he asked, so we went back and learned some of the Maimorim that Ayin Beis is based on, namely the Maimer HaMagbil L'Sheves, Mika Hashem Elokeinu HaMagbil L'Sheves from the Alter Rebbe and from the Mittler Rebbe and some other Maimorim. And now we're learning, informed by that, we're learning this section again. We began from page 1350 with the focus of trying to understand the bigger picture and especially how the themes develop and the questions are answered. And the process, we're obviously reviewing the whole this whole conclusion again of Ayin Beis. And as has been posted just recently, I wrote up some of what I've been discussing in these classes, the plot, so to speak, the Rebbe Rashab's general theme in Ayin Beis, and especially as it moves toward the end, what would have most likely been the conclusion had the Rebbe Rashab continued, based on Maimorim that he's basing this text on, as we've discussed. So, where are we in this plot right now? We're discussing the relationship between us and God, and particularly how much we affect, so to speak. And we know that human beings affect each other. Anyone that has a relationship, if it's a healthy relationship, there's an impact, there's a reciprocity, there's a call and response, call and response, action, reaction, cause and effect, etc. So there's a relationship. We're told that we have a relationship with God. Like the very pasuk we're talking about, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Okay, but then we continue, V'haftas Hashem Elokecha. You shall love God b'chol levavcha, with all your heart and with all your soul, chol nafshecha v'chol meidech. V'hafta is a relationship. How could there be a relationship between two entities that are so different in every possible way? Creator, creation, beyond infinite, finite, mortal, immortal, change, immutable, mutable, as we discussed at length. So God, of course, can do anything he wants, but that's not the goal. The goal is that we should be able to do it and relate to it and understand it. So God put into a system, created a system and a process which we call Seder Shtalshelus, a cosmic order, that begins actually in a way that even before Seder Shtalshelus, because Seder Shtalshelus itself, you can say, where does it begin? In Atzilus, and Chochmah, and Bina, there are different ways it's explained. But Seder Shtalshelus, what I mean here is in the broadest sense of the word, so it's anything after the Tzimtzum. But as we learned also before the Tzimtzum, there's a certain Seder as well. We won't call it Seder Shtalshelus, but we call it within the divine Eireh itself, Lifnei Tzimtzum, Eireh Kol Batzmuse itself. There's also so-called levels, relatively speaking. So this is the process God put into place that allows us to be that allows it to be an interface and a bridge. Sometimes I refer to it stepping stones, where we can understand God's way of creation, His process, and retrace the steps through our Aveda. We can climb the mountain, so to speak, or the ladder, whatever analogy you want to use, to reconnect even to the highest levels of the divine. And as he discussed in the middle of volume 2, and continuing from there, how is it possible that a post-Tzimtzum existence can experience a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness or a pre-Tzimtzum reality when all of existence is predicated on the Tzimtzum? And the answer was because the Tzimtzum itself can be transformed because it's not an end in itself. As we've been learning even here, that the Tzimtzum is B'shvil Hagili. The whole purpose of the Tzimtzum is not to conceal. Initially, the concealment is in order for us to be able to exist, like the student needs to have space. But the ultimate goal is just to exist and then to absorb and integrate the godliness all the way to the godliness before the Tzimtzum. So all this is the central theme of Ayin Beis in general. Where we are now is the specifics of the process, especially in context of the contrast between neshamas and malachim, that neshamas obviously are the ones that execute and implement this whole plan. They're the ones that come down to this world, and in this world use the powers and resources they were given, the souls that is, to transform the world and make it into Adira B'Tachtenim. But they don't come unarmed. The soul, besides having Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, its own power, its own flame, it also is given Ner Mitzvah and Torah Eir. Or in the language we're learning here, the language of the Siyua, of Eir, Torah Eir, Einei Ha'eda, the leaders, and of course also the Malachim, Einei Hashem, that help us in this process of refining the world and connecting it to godliness. And specifically the angels that are called Kravayim, the cosmic digestive system that process and distribute and allocate. So they the Hamshacha Velakus, as well as our Aveda, the Aveda Sabirudim, just like when you eat food, the digestive system breaks it down and allows it to be absorbed into the bloodstream and then distributed to all parts of the body, expelling the waste, the same as the role of the Malach. In that context, he brought the pasuk, Hamu Meyai Loi, that because Ben Yakeli Ephraim, my child is so precious, so when he's in a state of a difficult state, Hashem says, my innards are anguish over him. So he explained, Meyai is the innards, the intestines, the guts, the digestive system, Rachem Arachmenu, that have compassion over him. So that led us into a discussion of what does it mean that God has compassion, and what does it mean that God has midas altogether. So now the topic is really in this relationship with God. What does that mean when God is so different than we are? He's not affected by us like we are affected by each other. So what does midas mean? So we've been learning that there's that the midas themselves, essentially divine attributes or the emotions of existence, they also go through a process. The process I've been discussing. It begins with first that God chose with his koyach hagvul. He has in general, God's power, capacity to reveal, to conceal, to combine both of them, which ultimately will evolve, mistayef as he calls it, will branch off, and from there will come chesed, gvura, teferes. So this is not due because he's affected by anything. The divine emotions or divine attributes are due to shlemus ha'atzmos. But there it's not in the form of hispilus. It's not affected at all. It's purely God, b'tzad etzem, like he says. He has these qualities. That doesn't define God, but he chose to manifest in these attributes. Then comes the level of Atzilus. That's the Mailam Atzilus. Then comes the level of Atzilus, where in Atzilus, these midas become what he called hispilus hergish. They actually have now a sense and a feeling. They're still not stimulated or affected by the nivroim, by the actions below, but now they are not just conceptual or abstract. They do have hispilus, what he calls hergish. And then came the next level, and that's because there's a tzimtzum. So that's what we learned. The tzimtzum causes that it should be like chutzlatz musay, atzilus, like the difference in oir and atzilus. That's Chanu v'racham. The yud is the tzimtzum of avaya. Okay. And that causes these midas should have a connection to biyah, but they're still not biyah. He says, there's no ispilus b'sad on Ephraim, ve'ein b'hem shinui klal. It's still in a state of immutability. But then, and also because biyah can't contain such intensity. But then he goes on and says, because of it is Ein Sof. Umashashayir b'chinas ispilus. That's what we began learning. I'm reading now at the bottom of 1425. What is Malchus of Atzilus? Malchus is now a bridge from Atzilus to Biyah. So there, he says, in Malchus, you could talk about Tamakud de Biyah, Asad de Mishtana. It's a domain, an area that is subject to change. And there, Negeya Maisa Tachtenim. Then our actions below there do affect. So now we're getting to a place where the midas have evolved to a point where there is a relationship closer to us than the higher levels. But there are still those higher levels because we want to connect to God on his terms. So here he brought the Zohar in Vayechi, the Sheshana Samokim, the roses in the valley. So he compares, so he says Sheshana, rose, is also from the word Shinui, change. And this refers to the rose as it changes its colors from one color, from beautiful to not so beautiful. He says, that's kefi maisa tachtenim. those changes occur as a result of our actions. That's how the Ashpoah comes from Malchus. And that's where we stopped. That's where we stopped. So now we see that the midas are beginning to evolve into existence, which ultimately will be the root of our midas, meaning the human faculties. But even in the divine, the midas from Malchus, and as it comes into Biyah, is impacted. And he's going to explain that now as we continue learning the bottom of page 1428. And I'll continue reading. I am at 8 lines from the bottom of the page 1428. Pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Unless someone has questions, I'll begin continuing where we left off here. So he says like this: V'gam zeh, and even this that we just said, that Malchus is already asad the mishtana. It's a area, it's a domain that is subject to change. In contrast to the higher levels where loishanisi, that are immutable. He says, even that is not Malchus, pure Malchus as it is in Atzilus. It's hu kamoisha Malchus ba b'bchinas islapshus. So now Malchus itself is going through transition. Malchus comes in a manifest way, islapshus. In other words, Malchus itself can be as it's part of Atzilus and receiving from the higher levels. Think of the moon, which is compared to Malchus, as it's receiving light from the sun. Then it's more of an receptive mode. But then there's the moon that gives off light. That's already how Malchus is manifesting b'islapshus. So b'islapshus, like the Pardes says, K'mesh Kosov Pardes b'shara kinuyim, Pardes of Ramesha Korevir Ramak, Erech Shinui. So there he has a section in the Pardes that goes in alphabetical order, like almost like encyclopedic on Kabbalistic terms. So in the entry on the word shinui, he says she'ein shinui ela b'chinas malchus kishemelubeshes b'matat. That what we said, that malchus, like the rose that its colors are changing, is not malchus on its own. It's only as malchus manifests in matat. Now we may recall matat. Matat is the name of one of the angels, a very significant category of angels that we learned on the bottom of earlier page, that are tefillas, if you remember. Matat keshik sudden, at the bottom of page 1426, he says the angel Matat, we don't always pronounce the full word, but it's Matatren is the full name, but Matat is keshik sudden, it takes our prayers and weaves crowns from them. So we see that this now is going back to the angels. So clearly, as the Pardes says, the shinui in Malchus is because Malchus, as it manifests and enclosed in Matat. Just a few words about the word hislapshus. When you say Chassidus hislapshus, it's like when you put on a garment. Slapshus is literally levush. So the garment is not you, but you're putting it on, and now it reflects you, and it fits you, and you're expressing yourself through your garment. So you say koiches hanefesh, like Chachma through Malchus, that's the actual faculties. A lavush is not one of the faculties, but it still becomes part of you. Your jacket, your shirt, your blouse, whatever it may be. These are all parts of the garments. In Avodah, it's machshava dibra ma'isa are called the 3 garments that manifest all our faculties, thought, speech, and action. So when you say something is bislapshus, it means it's engaging with, or even better, it assumes certain properties. When you say something is, for example, derech maiver in Chassidus, maiver means just passing through. Meaning it's not like, for example, a funnel. If you pour wine through a funnel, the funnel does not change the wine at all. It's just a channel. But if you pour the wine through a certain type of other kelim that can actually mix certain ingredients into it, then the wine can actually be changed. So he's saying here, Malchus is now in a state of islapshus in Matat, this level of angel. And that's where there's shinui in Malchus. So Malchus itself, it's not Malchus in its pristine state, it's Malchus as it's mislabish in Matat. Now, why is this so important? Because for the same reason. Why is he so adamant to insist that something of Leish Nisi is always retained. Because remember, we want a relationship with God also on God's terms. If the relationship would only be on the divine, Malchus and Matat, as it relates to us, then that would be our ceiling. But we want a relationship with Ani Hashem Leish Nisi, like we discussed a few days ago, that even in a world of a temporary world, we want to experience eternity, Leish Nisi, things that are not changeable. And for that, whatever level Elikus manifests, it always remains somewhat still under the impact of the Leish Nisi. So on the higher levels, you see it very obviously. Lifnei Atzilus. Even Atzilus Leish Nisi, even though it's already middays of hergish, of feeling. And now Malchus is a shinui, but it's only in Malchus as it's mislabish, as it manifests in Matat, into Biyah, but not Malchus on its own. So you see that Malchus has both elements to it, so it could serve as a good bridge between these two experiences. Is it changeable or is it not changeable? When you do a mitzvah in a particular moment in the day, where that moment will then pass, it's a fleeting moment. The mitzvah on one hand is eternal, but the mitzvah is also done that moment. So you see a combination of the shinui of Zman and Mokim, space, time and space, and something that's higher than time and space, as we discussed a few classes back. Okay. So it's mistabeshes b'matat. And now he's going to continue to explain what the break down the dynamics of ha'maisa tachtenim, because remember he said maisa tachtenim, it's negeya in Malchus, but now he explained Malchus as it manifests in Matat. And this is going to be the connecting it back to the angels and their role, because their role we know is processing. Their role is not feeding, because the food is coming through the Aveda of the Neshamas, the Berurim. But their role is processing, and part of processing is making sure that our Maisa Tachtenim is Negeya in Malchus, as we're going to discuss now. Now, but if anybody wants to ask anything about what we just learned, we're not finished the subject, I'm happy to stop for a moment. So continuing on, he says, "V'hu and this, what we're learning now, is like it says elsewhere. The Mashanegeya v'nika Maisa Tachtenim is going back to Maisa Tachtenim, that it's Negeya. And remember, Negeya means it's vital, it's important, and it touches. From the word Negeya, like it touches. V'nikir, and there's an obvious impact. V'nikir Maisa Tachtenim is discernible. Hu b'hamalochim hanikroim Einei Hashem. It's the angels of God that are called the eyes of God. So let's go back to the example I gave with the king and his ministers, or governors, if you wish, or ambassadors, whatever mashal you want to use. So the king lives in his palace. I'm talking about a human example now. And he simply is not capable. We're not talking by God, you can't say that. But the king appoints governors for each part of the region in his empire, or ambassadors, ministers, that their role is to interact with the people of each particular province. That's the way a good leadership is done. It's a delegation. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, after Yisro suggested, he delegated. Sari Alofim, Sari Meis, different groups, different leaders, so the people could go consult with them, and if that they needed more, they would go to a next level of the hierarchy, all the way back to Moshe. So it's a delegation process. That's the way it works. Hashem, of course, is not bound by that. He could have done everything himself, but again, he wants a relationship with us on our terms, and we should be able to relate to it. Not just that God can do kol yochel, anything he wants. So he also created a Seder Shtalshlus with ministers. And part of that process is the Malachim. So the Malachim are his Einei Hashem, they are his supervisors that he appoints to watch. Now you'll say, well, God can't be watching. He is watching, but Malachim we can relate to more. And that's the role that they play. So it says elsewhere, he says, that when we say Maisa Tachtenim, so in this example, if the people want to request something from the king, what do? They don't go directly to the king. They go to the minister. Like we know here exactly in every government. You want something from the government, you don't go to the president. You submit a request, an application, to whatever department, the relevant department, and then there's a whole hierarchy. And again, this is not because we're not speaking to God. We'll soon get to the nimshal. But it means it creates it in a way that it's commensurate to us. God could have, for example, every child in its mother's womb learns the entire Torah. But who's teaching it? It says a malach. Why doesn't God himself teach it? And then the child is born and goes to school. Why doesn't God himself come and teach every child Torah? So the answer is God sent messengers. They're his shluchim. So in a way, they are shluchim shlodim kamesei. They're fulfilling his job, but because he wants it to be relatable to us. This is a very good example. The very reason why Hashem sent Moshe Rabbeinu. He couldn't take the Jews out of Egypt himself. He couldn't give the Torah himself to us, because he wants it to be relatable to us, and we have someone to access. Exactly the concept of interface. Back to the central theme of Ayin Beis. So when you say Ma'aser Tachtenim is Negeya, the king, I don't call him aloof, but he lives in his own domain. It's the ministers, in this case the Malachim, that engage with our actions. So when we do a Ma'aser Tachtenim, our Avodah, who is it Negeya and where is it Nikr, it's where we submit it to that department in the mashal that I used, which in this case the Malachim, which is the Malchus as it manifests in Matat, as he just said. And it's through them, these messengers, these angels that are the supervisors, the avodah that we do, from there it elevates Malchus into the level of Malchus that manifested in Matat, which is a Malach, Ubchinas Kalim, the Midas Atzilus, and to the Kalim of Midas Atzilus. So you see here the actual dynamics of what happens when we do avodah. Because someone could argue, a person, a mere mortal on this earth, does a mitzvah. So we know that it creates a ripple effect. This mitzvah creates a birur and a yichud that ripples through the whole Seder Shtalshlus, through the whole cosmic order. But how do we understand that? So that's why God created all these steps. It's like triggers. Our avodah triggers something, which in turn triggers something else, and through that the whole process flows. So it's our ma'aser tachtenim, so-called, affect the malachim. The malachim in turn deliver it, like delivery people, like we spoke, the distributors. They deliver it, because here we're talking mamat l'mayla. Before we spoke, the malachim bring it down. Same thing, mamat l'mayla. Like they take our prayers and they weave crowns. Why can't God weave his own crowns? Again, it's a process of integration. And that's step by step. You don't bring the biggest Gaon scholar to teach 5-year-olds. You have a teacher that's commensurate to them. Then they grow, and then they reach out. So then the Malachim deliver it to Malchus and to the Kalim of the Midas of Atzilus. And remember, the Midas of Atzilus are immutable. They're hergish. There's actual emotions, like we spoke, but it's not emotions infected by us. But they definitely are. But our avodah is delivered now to these Midas of the Kalim of Midas of Atzilus. And now you understand partially also why you need Kalim. Both Mamayla Mata, Mamat Lamayla. You need Kalim because God, of course, can create existence as he wishes. But when he says Yehi Oyer, and he gives it body and form through the words that he utters, actual words, Yehi Oyer, like we learned earlier, Oisis Hadibur. It's not machshava. It's not abstract letters, it's actual tangible letters. And those letters are words, so he creates. So that's the Kalim, like we learned Oisis and Kam. The same thing the other way around, from the bottom up. That the first thing we affect are the Kalim. That like in a relationship. First you affect the Kalim, and then we're going to learn how from the Kalim it affects the Oiris, and all the way upward. But the word effect is a very word that you have to be very careful with, because there's a place where there's shinui and there's a place where there's no shinui. So first we're talking right now, this level, as the malachim serve the role of carrying being affected by the ma'aser tachtenim, like the ministers that are, or the governors that are engaging with each province or each area, the people of that place. And that is the so that was the halah, the avodah from above. The same thing, the hamshacha, when your mamshech alakus through our avodah would draw down, like you said earlier, everything that's drawn down comes through our avodah. Slapshus by malachim, and through manifesting in the angels. The case, think of them as the messengers. These the deliverers. Well, that causes it to be commensurate to biyah. So the malachim, like in the digestive system, the food itself is just it's in a state you can't benefit from it until it's broken down through the digestive system. And that's what the malachim are doing. They bring it into be'erech biyah, because Atzilus, like we said on its own, is Ein Sof and Bligvul. Even though it's already mides and lower than the levels higher than Atzilus. But relative to biyah, it's not yet integrated. It cannot fully enter. So the malachim serve that role. Okay. Look at the Teda. There he talks about this more. There he talks about the shoes. Refers to malachim as well. There's a malach called sandal like shoes. They serve as levushim, like garments, and there are different levels of malachim, like we learned, that carry the energy into a flow that can be integrated and internalized in lower levels. For kol ha'amshachas, but where do all the amshachas come from? They're not coming from Malchus. They're not coming from the Malachim. They're not coming from Malchus. They're not coming from the Kalim. Hey, mebchinas ha'er Atzilus. They all originate from the Eir. What's a Kali? What's letters of speech if you don't have an energy within it? When Hashem says you hear Eir, it's not just he's saying words. Those words are carrying the power of creating light. So the Kalim and the Levushim that we're discussing are carriers. Like I spoke about the Malachim, the digestive system does not provide the food. The food has to come from a higher place. And then they process it. So he says it's all from the Eir of Atzilus. But in the Eir of Atzilus, like we learned, there's no Ispilus. It's not affected by anything because it retains its divine personality. It's all about God's flow, not about us affecting God. Ub'chinas Malchus. But then in Malchus, ukeshabah b'chinas islapshus, and as Malchus comes in a state of islapshus, manifest alizeh b'chinas ispilus, then you can talk it in terms of a real relationship that affects his spilus. And here clearly he's talking about his spilus, not just the spilus of hergish, of the midas of Atzilus, but his spilus in a way that there is something like we spoke about. You can relate to the governor or to the minister because that's what God wanted. He wanted you to have a level that you can communicate with on your level. Somewhat, just to give an example, the difference between Aaron and Moshe. So Aaron is called Sheshbina de Matronissa, and Moshe is called Sheshbina de Malka. Sheshbina de Malka means the support or the escort of the king, and Aaron is called the escort of the Matronissa of the queen. So Chassidus explains, like we know, that Aaron was engaged with the people. He would go around and talk to individuals and make shalom. Talmidav shalom, Oyev shalom, Veredav shalom. And he would make shalom bayis. That's why it says when he passed away, the entire nation, not just Bnei Yisrael, Kol Yisrael, everyone mourned him. Moshe, even though of course he was Moshe himself, but Moshe was a little more representing God. He represented the king. So Moshe was not engaging like, let's say, a mashpia that you speak to on a daily basis, or someone relates to you. He's not a rebbe. A rebbe is more of God's representative. The mashpia can help explain what the rebbe says, similar to what we're talking about here. So that's where's their engagement, what we call ispilus, is with a level that you can relate to. Not the level, the higher levels are more representative of the divine immutability, the Lo Shanisi that we talked about. That's not ispilus. So we'll read one more line and then I shall stop for questions. Remember, I referred to Teira Er a number of times. Erdana. This Teira Er is sometimes called Erdana, sometimes called Pasach Eliyahu in Vayera. So he says in Pasha Vayera that Ba'kelim u'b'chinas Yedeya. Elakus in the Kelim, if you remember, I explained, Yedeya means he knows. U'ba'er u'b'chinas Yadua. And the Oid, it's more, it is known. So when you say something is known, it means that entity is removed from the experience, but it's known to it. It's like a bird's eye view, so to speak. But Erdana, when God says, let us descend, Hislapshus, into Malchus, into Biyah, then you say the word Yedeya, he knows. Not just it's known to him, but he knows, which is very different. So obviously, for example, people, I remember as Bachrim, we would always ask the question, does the Rebbe know every individual chassid and every individual that passes by? So from the level of Ruach HaKodesh, that he has the ability to know that everything is known to him. But it doesn't mean necessarily that he's now engaging. That's why the Rebbe would ask sometimes, what's your name? And so on. Engaging means I know I'm engaging with you like one-on-one, so to speak, where there is that involvement. And that's the difference between the Oiris and the Kalim. The Kalim is more engaged. And the Oiris are more the Hamshach itself is coming from there, but the engagement and the effect, therefore, is not quite the same. That's why it's called not hispilus. Okay, now is the next section is going to sum it up in the context of Malachim, the role they play in this, all of this, the Hamumei and so on. But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay.
Rabbi Jacob said it just because there is a system in place, obviously, and for majority of the time, these are the malachim that actually, take our prayer up and do all kinds of different things. But that doesn't mean that the Jewish neshama doesn't have a direct, not connection, but meaning that I could speak to God and I could pray to God, and I don't need malachim necessarily. And there are moments, let's say Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah, or whatever, there are moments that I could connect directly without any intervention of any malachim. Is that correct?
That's a question.
Yeah, but it needs to be elaborated upon what that means, because even on Yom Kippur, we also talk about malachim. Not like they disappear. And let's put it this way. We all talk about support systems, right? Every human being needs a support system. Would you say the same thing, that we don't need family, we don't need friends, we don't need mashpiyim mentors, we don't need teachers, because we have direct access to God? It would be a very sad life if a person did not have a support system. So see malachim exactly that way. They're not here to replace God. They are God's messengers to help us in our journey. So conceptually, can you get beyond malachim? We're going to talk later. There's a whole discussion in the Torah where Moshe said, I don't want a malach, I want directly from you. Moshe was on that level, perhaps. Yeshua, it had to be through a malach. So we're going to learn a little later. This comes back, this is a whole section now. We're going to learn later, I believe, I'll just tell you if you want to see it inside, that the malachim, especially in time of Golus, on page 1444, he starts speaking about that the neshamas hamakabel ava v'yira from malachim is primarily in Golus. But Golus also means like Yeshua compared to Moshe. So overall, everybody needs support. Even everybody needs support. The question is to what extent. And obviously different people on different levels. So that's my general response to you. That this part of the process, and you just can't. It's like saying, do I need Atzilus or can I jump over Atzilus? It doesn't work that way. You need to go through the steps. Now, if you're asking a person who's on the throes of tshuva and Yom Kippur, and there's no Aveda, they just cry out in distress, and will God listen to them? Of course, the kukuriku of the farm boy pierced the heavens and was able to abolish a gzera that all the great tzaddikim, with all their prayers and all their processes, didn't do. So of course there's that element. But number one is that's not what we don't. Then the next year, your Rosh Hashanah, everyone didn't say kukuriku. They went back to davening, and even the farm boy, you'd encourage him to learn how to daven. Why? Why can't he just cry kukuriku? Because you don't. That's an emergency call. That obviously there's always the ability, but even that requires a lot of work, and so you have to put things into context here.
Okay, thank you. Also, like Menashe, that was a Russia of our Rashaim, but yet it
What?
shows that Hashem listened to him directly. There were no angels in between, even though although angels even tried to block, but Hashem made an opening and listened to him
Anyway,
directly. Meaning,
but that's not what. So first of all, we haven't gotten there. As I said on page 1444, he talks about that. We'll learn it then. Right now, I always like to focus where we are right now. He's not made any exceptions right now. So you're doing processing right now. Learning what he says here, he's saying Malachim are part of the process of Seder Ishtalshelus. Is anyone here in this class reached 40 years old without first being 39 years old? Right? Why not? Why can't we just jump right away? Why can't we just get an injection from God to know Kol HaTorah Kula without having to study and learn? What would be your answer to that? Because that's the way it was built. That's with structure. And that's the only way it could be integrated. If it happens in a way where you can bypass this whole system and process, it wouldn't be you. It would be a miracle. And that's not the Avodah. Now, is it possible that a person through tshuva can... Yeah, but it's exceptions, and it's only short term. It's not long term. Yom Kippur is only once a year. You can't just say every day is Yom Kippur. Now you could say, can I always do tshuva? Of course you could always do tshuva. There's always the ability to call out to God from your, as I said, min ha-meitzar, and reach somewhere. But that's not a system of living our lives that way. Our lives have to be lived in an organized way, tamid considered on day by day. You daven 3 times a day. You don't get to Shema until later in davening. And the Shema itself, Shema Yisrael, v'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafsha, b'chol meidecha. So that is critical. And then there are the exceptions or the moments. Of course, there's an Eis Ratzon. There's an opportune time where you have more doors are open. Aser Shemei Tshuva is that way. But even there requires support and so on. And let's not be theoretical. Practically speaking, is there anyone here that says, I don't need support of anyone, I can just me and God? Of course we want support. That's tremendously necessary. Like the eye cannot see in the dark without a light. Okay. We're on top of page, we move to the next page, 1429. Any other questions? V'zehu the inyan rachamim shemispol yisrachim ala nevroim. So now he's going back to rachem arachmenu. Remember, the initial question was, how could you say rachmanis on Hashem? Completely removed. Rachmanis is a human experience. It's a result of our limitations. So he explained how there's rachamim l'mayla, that's lifnei Atzilus. Even rachamim and Atzilus. But what about the simple statement, does God have compassion when we're in pain? Does he feel our pain? So based on what we learned, higher than Malchus and the Shinui that happens in Malchus, in Matat, you could argue no. It's more like Yodua, not Yodeya. Does he know our pain? Yes, he knows it. But more like a judge, like he said, that passes judgment, but he himself is not affected by his judgment. Lezakai or lechayev. So here he says now, and this is what Rachman Shemispol Yisracham al Nevroim, that he gets affected to have compassion on the creations, even though the creation does not impact him. Who al yedei slapshus b'bechinas hamalchus u'b'matat. That elikus, as it manifests in slapshus and malchus and matat, malchus into matat, like we learned the malachim. That is where you find his spilus in a way that we can, the spilus that we relate to. In other words, a spilus that one thing does affect another. But higher than that, it's not quite like that, and we'll learn more how that works exactly. That's why it says, my innards, my intestine, my guts are anguished. Why guts? Why doesn't it just say, I'm in anguish over my child Ephraim, who's in a difficult situation? Why may I? Why do you say your innards? Dafka may I? Because b'chinas may I? B'chinas may shaykh in harachamim. I'm sorry, shaykh in hamiyah That's where anguish is possible. If you call it anguish, or agitated, or aggravated, whatever how they translate it, that's bechinas ispalas harachimim. That's dafke meyai. That's why it says, it could have said, my child Ephraim is precious to me. He's in pain, so I'm anguished over it. It says, no, my innards are anguished. Because it's talking about how Malchus manifests in matat, in meyai. And that's why my compassion will be compassionate for him. So that's how he explains the pasuk that we began and concludes what the beginning of the paragraph on page 1427. Before I continue, any questions? The next section is a little dense. I'm thinking of maybe skipping it even. See in a moment. Any points to clarify? Okay. Let me just look through the next section. It's all interesting and all valuable. I just don't want to get too distracted. I'm just looking through it. 1 second.
I have a question, Rabbi, when you're ready.
Yeah, you can go. Go.
In the matter of this communication system, if you want to call it that, through, in this case, the Malach Matat. So, and I think it said Matat transmits let's say it's Tefillah, for example, to the Keli of Malchus, I think he said. But in any case, it works its way up and becomes known to God. So even
Not
though
not known, to know.
Oh, it's Yodea.
That level is Yodea, yeah.
But the Abishter himself, it's Yadua, correct?
What means the Abish to himself? The higher levels he called Ur.
Well,
the
the
level
Or,
of Ur,
okay, fine.
it's
The Or.
Yodua, and the level of Kalim is called Yodea.
Okay, thank you. My question is, even though my prayer is not going directly to Or, if you will, it's going through Matat, and Matat's going to the Keli, and then I guess it gets transmitted to the Or from the Keli. But the point is that at some point the message gets through, even though it's not direct, but at some point it does reach this level of Yadua. So it is getting through to the Avishter. It's just not direct. And there is a response. I mean, Mirza Shem, the answer may be no, but it gets through. The question is posed. So what I don't want to be so crass to say what difference does it make whether I can directly connect with the Or if it goes through Matat, it goes to the Keli, and then it gets, you see, it's still getting through. So doesn't it still raise the question of Shinui? I mean, and God answers prayers, we believe, unless you're going to say, well, no, it's not really God, it's the Malach. So I'm going to pray, I'll make a prayer to the Abishter, get to the Malach.
Okay, so the answer is, firstly, we haven't finished the subject yet.
And then you're saying Matat is answering? Matat's not answering, it's just a conduit.
I hear your question, let me respond.
Okay.
So firstly, we are in the middle of the topic. So in truth is, I think it will be easier to understand once we finish the next few pages. Like I said, he's going to talk about this for quite a few pages now. That's really the point. But I've already, I thought, explained it to preempt these questions. So number one, this whole discussion that it's not direct or it ends up by God, that's not from the Maimer here in Ayin Beis. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't say here that it's not directly to God. So let's make that very clear. So let's just So that addition that you added, that's not direct, it's to the angel, is not correct. It's direct to, we daven only to one God. There's no more than one God. God himself put a system in place. God said, I'm making it easier for you. Instead of you coming to my palace and speaking to me, I'm sending you my messenger, Shluchei Shalodem Kamoise. I mentioned several times. My shliach, he's like me, an extension of me, an extension of my authority. And that makes it easier. Like I said, why do we need teachers? Why can't we just learn directly? When you're learning Torah, you're learning God's Torah, you're learning your teacher's Torah. You're learning God's Torah. It's just the teacher is helping you understand it. When you eat a piece of food and the digestive system breaks it down, is the digestive system feeding you or is the food feeding you? It's the food that's feeding you. However, the digestive system is a system in place that helps break down the food and makes it about ability to digest it and internalize it and turn the nutrients into blood and expel the waste, etc. So now you have to keep in mind it's all about God. It's just the way God did it in a way that makes it easier, like a support. When the eye sees in the dark, it's the eye that sees, but the light helps it see. So our teachers, the Torah, which is called Torah Oir, Ner Mitzvah, learn later, Malachim, Ein Hashem, they're all that support system. So now, regarding the concept of Shina, I made it very clear several times. You want to have God's immutability because then you have a real relationship with God himself, not just as God relates to us. You know, when a father, let's say, bends down to his child and plays with him, that's the parent relating to the child on the child's terms. Can the child relate to the parent on the parent's terms? That requires much more avodah. So God wants us to have the experience. I gave a long discussion about bringing not shinui into the world of shinui, into time and space that's completely subject to changes. We want to have the immutability and the nitzchias, the eternity, even in a moment, in a world of change. So how do you join those two worlds without one being compromised? So here you have this brilliant and most eloquent way of explaining it. There's the process where we relate with the divine elements, like in Malchus, Beslapshus, and Matat, that relates to existence. And there is like a relationship as one speaks as a relationship relatively like humans, where the may there's the compassion, and then there's the part that is also involved, but it's involved more on God's terms. So it's not like he's affected by us. So like the Malachim are delivering to the king the message, and that's immediate. That doesn't take time at all. It's happening the second you daven. Hashem is listening, but it's with their support. And on those levels, you're talking about a level that is beyond shinui. And therefore, you have both elements involved here. Both the levels of the divine as they relate to existence and the levels of the divine that are beyond existence.
I see.
That's the key point here to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you. Is it fair to say that the Malachim are essentially also an interface in a sense?
I said that several times, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Malchus is interface. Everything is an interface, ultimately.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I decided I'm going to skip the next section simply because it's dense and going to take time, and I rely on that. I taught it the first time. It's essentially a Tzemach Tzedek's gloss that he adds. I'll just sum up what he's going to say. He's bringing a pasuk from Shir Hashirim where it talks about, I think it's Shir Hashirim, let me see, I think I have it here, 5:14, yeah. He says his abdomen is made of eshes shein. His abdomen is like a block of ivory. Shein is ivory. And so Meyav, so it also uses the word Meyav. So the Tzemach Tzedek explains how that relates to this whole discussion. It's referring to the 12 tribes, the 12. Yeah. So as I said, I'm not going to go through this. It just brings more support to the idea that he spoke about before. If you want to look it up, you can look it up in the classes I taught the first time around. So some things I'm just going to do that. And the end of the paragraph, he goes back what we say in Yetzer Oir, in the bracha before Shema, we say, B'rachamecha harabim rachem aleinu. So you see how that fits, because there we talk about the malachim. Before Shema, why do we talk about malachim? As we're going to learn later, and we discussed a number of times, is because that's the support that helps us get to Shema, where the neshama is contemplating on Achdus Hashem, but the malachim are helping support that contemplation, that Mayrich Be'echad. The malachim are helping, and that's why we say, B'rachamecha rarabim rachem aleinu. With your great compassions, have compassion over us, because it's the malachim that help achieve that experience. They're the mayai, like he said, like the digestive system that allows us to do that. Okay. So with that, we conclude the paragraph on page 1429. And just as an introduction to the next paragraph, which will begin tomorrow, he says, "Ubir inyan anal," and he even says what? The shinui sheikh rabchinis Malchus, as a manifest matat, but higher than Atzilus. It's not the case, even the Hashpah comes from there. He's now going to explain that in the next section. More longer discussion. What does that mean? That the shinui is on one level, but not on the next. And that will help also answer your question. At the end of the day, what difference does it make? If it's all being experienced, but you're going to see the difference is going to be, because as I said, it's both on our terms and on God's terms. That's a key element to keep in mind as we continue to learn this. It's like the reason we have Yehuda Tata, Yehuda Elah, and then the combination of both, because Yehuda Tata is on our terms. It's a Yichud, the divine, as it relates to existence. If you jumped right away to Yehuda Elah, or to even higher than that, it wouldn't be part of our lives. Yehuda Elah, on the other hand, is more on God's terms. And then you have the joining of both. And there's no way to get to number 3 without number 1 and 2. So that's where we're going to ultimately understand the total integration of both experiences. So we need to have both the world of Shinui, that's our world, and the world beyond Shinui, and then how they join together. And that's going to be the ultimate seamless union once we contemplate on all these different levels. So we have all these different things to talk about. Yeah.
There's a little bit of a paradox, and maybe you'll think we're getting ahead of ourselves, but it seems there's a paradox based on, what you just said, that ultimately there's a yichud, and that we may see things behischalkus and differentiated and series of steps, madregos, even infinite steps. From our perspective, but from Abish's perspective, it's all one reality to him. For him, he's immediately present. We may not see him being immediately present. I'm talking about Atzilus now, but he's here, and so.
Yeah, but the goal is that we should be there. That's the question. Not that he's there. We know that's not
right.
I know, but he doesn't need to create existence for that purpose.
Right. I hear you. That wasn't my point. My point is that we're davening, right? And so, in a sense, because he is here, we, for our sake, it goes through this communications network with the Malachim, etc. But yet, Atzilus is he's also right here. You can't say he's not hearing. It's a mechanism.
But that's not on our terms. We want it to be a dira b'tachtenim, that we should experience it, and it should be God doesn't need to create existence for that. The whole purpose of creation is that it should be experienced by us. That's like saying your brilliant teacher knows the whole Torah, even when he's teaching you Ayin Beis. The goal is that you should know the whole Torah, not just that he knows. And that's where you need the whole the system here. Yeah, and the growth we go through is higher states of consciousness. Ultimately, we want to understand the divine consciousness as best as we can, each of us commensurate to where we stand. The goal is not to remain where we are, but to constantly grow in our ability to broaden our horizons until the point where we learn how God sees things. And that, again, there's many different levels. Many of us understand how God sees things very differently, depending where you are in your avodah and your level of comprehension. Okay, yeah. So we'll stop here. End of the paragraph, page 1429. Let me stop the recording.